Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is an honor to be in conversation with you all and to be in conversation with the work and the legacy of Dr. Lewis. I'm going to be presenting today around the diasporic vision that Samella Lewis built throughout her career. This project, my project, is part of a larger collaborative research project at the Getty Research Institute in collaboration with Emory University. I work with Rebecca Peabody and Clint Fluker on a project named Samella Lewis, World Building in African American Art. Stemming from Afrofuturism, we are thinking about world building and how it speaks to the way in which Dr. Lewis imagined a world of creative, emancipatory expression and the documentation of it, and built step by step an apparatus of African American art history that included journals, texts, exhibitions, slides, catalogs, artwork, you name it. What she saw in the world is a way that I think that she models this practice of doing what needs to be done. I'm really grateful to be in conversation with Claude. And I did not know Dr. Lewis personally, and so what I have had to rely on are her archive at Emory University, her oral history that we conducted at the Getty Research Institute, and speaking with her loved ones. So it is really an honor to be able to kind of pull this information together today. Our project is centered around the notion that Samella Lewis's story is the story of American art. Through her story, we see the transformation occurring from wartime to post-war America, from the perspective of the unique American city of New Orleans. The rise of labor movements and the Red Scare, Jim Crow, the rise of the civil rights movement, the Black arts and Black power movements here in Los Angeles, and she continued to curate exhibitions into the 90s and make art all of her life. I'll be talking today about Lewis's efforts to foster an interconnected way of seeing creative production across the diaspora. She did so as an artist, a scholar, and a curator. And through her exhibition making, she cultivated a curatorial investment in artists. In doing so, she developed an aesthetic framework for the field and a community discourse. I will be situating her exhibition making within her multidimensional practice, attending to the personal, the spiritual, aesthetic, and community forces of Black art that she found to be the connective thread across the diaspora. For Lewis, this was a new way of seeing. Throughout the talk, I will also include quotes by Lewis that ground my work through her own words. I see this as following in the spirit of her work with Ruth Waddy, Black Artists on Art. And I also invite you all, as I'm speaking, to share your stories and memories of her as we move along. So please don't wait to the end. If something moves you or moves you to a memory, please do share as we go. This presentation, what we'll be looking at is a lot of the reference photos that I've taken in Emory's archive, along with, we'll pull in some of the work that's in this exhibition as well. So this is a newspaper clipping from the Los Angeles Tribune in 1943. It details Samella Lewis as a rising, young person of distinction at Hampton Institute. So this would be her sophomore year. She started in 1942 at Dillard University. Samella Lewis was born in 1923 in New Orleans, the city whose unique past and cultural racial makeup made strict classifications of race both complex and allowed and curtailed possibilities for advancement in the city. It was also a city with two notable historically Black colleges, Xavier and Dillard. Lewis would attend Dillard, and prior to that, she studied with the noted portrait painter, the Italian immigrant Alfredo Gauli. In her oral history, she speaks about the impact of the Bayou Teche region on her life. This is where her mother's people are from. It is where she experienced racialized segregation most forcefully. But it is also where she learned the deep spiritual lives of those in the region who practice voodoo and hoodoo. And a lot of the symbolism that she developed came from this region. These ideas become central to her connection to the diaspora. She explains in her oral history, quote, "I got more out of that region than any other place. I've learned in terms of spiritual kinds of things and seeing how people lived." And she makes this connection to what she learned growing up and moving between New Orleans and the Bayou Teche region to her experiences in Brazil. And for Lewis, this spiritual richness enabled her to foster relationships with people around the world from different backgrounds because they shared this interconnected tether of a spiritual practice. So I just want to take that moment to point to this work here, this untitled drawing of the back of a woman. This would have been done her freshman year at Dillard. She enrolls there, as I mentioned, in 1942, in the middle of World War II. She enrolls with the help of her drafting teacher, Mr. Spriggins, who she describes as literally taking her by the hand into the admin office to apply to go to school there. At Dillard, she takes classes with Elizabeth Catlett and Charles White. And in her oral history, she recalls that learning from Catlett was an experience of learning about the philosophy of making art, particularly around portraiture, and getting to know the sitter in some way. She follows Catlett to Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, and it was from Catlett that she began to realize that you paint because you have an idea about something. You don't have to copy what you see. You bring something of what you think into it. In her oral history, Lewis recalls how Catlett agitated the system of legal segregation in New Orleans by doing things like throwing out the signs on the bus dictating where colored people had to sit. Lewis would attend longshoremen meetings with Catlett. And she recalls, I had never met anybody like her who insisted on being counted. It was from Catlett that Lewis begins to understand an activist position as an artist. She also, in her oral history, recalls this instant where Catlett wants to take her students to see a Picasso show at what was called the Delgado Museum. And the Delgado Museum was located inside of a park where Black people were not allowed. And so what Catlett did was she rented a bus and she drove these students directly to the steps of the museum so that they could bypass these rules. And once they stepped on the steps of the museum, they were allowed to enter. And this was the first time that she and those students had entered a museum before. Lewis describes Catlett also as the one who introduced me to Cézanne. She taught me that even if you make 3 strokes, that those strokes should be a complete composition and that there should be no other stroke there unless it was necessary. So she really taught me how to build up and how to work with drawings and paintings, because I think the whole idea of breaking down the surface so that it ceased to be paint is what was most important to me. When she gets to Hampton, she begins in an ongoing dialogue with Victor Lowenfeld, a prominent arts educator. He was prominent in the field of art education. And he really shared with her these ideas around authenticity and expressiveness in art making. It's with Lowenfeld's support that she enrolls at Ohio State, receiving an MA and later a Ph.D. in art history in 1951, making her the first Black woman to receive a Ph.D. in art history. But she's taking these courses and she's realizing that the focus of European art is unfulfilling, and through the suggestion of her advisor, starts taking classes in the anthropology department. So Lowenfeld helps her make art from her experiences and encourages her to learn about expressionism. To put into context works in this exhibition, we can see this drawing, this untitled drawing, Picking Cotton, and the gouache and watercolor profile of a man was made during this time. I think that's around the corner. while she's completing her Ph.D. Lewis says, Lowenfeld did a lot to help me approach my art from a point of view where I was working from experience. I would seldom make drawings for paintings. My drawings were always for drawings. My canvases are always blank when I put them before me, even more so now. I would wait, I guess, for the silent voices. It sounds really weird, but I would wait until I saw a fleeting glance. Generally, what I wanted to do and how I wanted to begin the images came forth out of my mind. But it's almost as though I could see them and I could put them down very quickly. Some of my most important works were painted in 20 minutes, but thought about in 6 hours or 6 months. It became clear to me that this is what I want to do. The work doesn't grow from putting one shape next to another, as much as from images that seem to emerge out of a belief system that I didn't know that I held. Even when some things happened that probably grew out of the experience of going back and forth to Bayou Country. And this is something that I found really striking, is that she speaks around kind of gaining this knowledge or this belief system from those around her without necessarily having to be told what it is and what it means. She talks about crossing the river and gaining this knowledge from that passageway. And so there's this spiritual practice, this spiritual kind of knowledge that she is at her foundation, then taking with her as she moves into academia and as she starts to build her career, but as an artist, as an art historian, and as a curator. In this room, there's a drawing and a print of migrants. And you can see that she's working from two different scales here. And I think what's interesting is she also talks about this idea of working through an idea of drawing multiple times to get towards something, of not moving on until she finalized it. So I don't know if this is an exact kind of expression of that experimentation, but we can see through this kind of these two different ways of trying to visualize this scene that she's working through, this idea that she's trying to visualize. And I'm gonna look at you, Claude, and ask, if this way of painting was, allowing the images to emerge, if that's something that strikes you as something you witnessed or experienced or heard her talk about.
I think so, because like you said, she never did a sketch on the canvas. It all came from up here. So that was interesting.
Thank you.
And sometimes she would start something and then see something else and just kind of can't erase the paint, but she would go over it, do what she's saying.
Thank you. So Samella Lewis receives her Ph.D. and teaches at Morgan State, and then at Florida A&M between 1953 and 1958. In Florida, she and her husband, Paul, began getting involved in a burgeoning civil rights movement, and this activity does not go unnoticed. It is later that Lowenfeld would help her secure a position at Plattsburgh after the Klan terrorized her and attacked her family home. In the 1960s at Plattsburgh, she becomes interested in Chinese and Japanese calligraphy. At Plattsburgh, she has this proximity to universities in Canada like McGill. She starts to engage more with people of East Africa and those who escaped apartheid in South Africa or moved to Tanzania and so on. So for Lewis, Chinese and Japanese calligraphy also held global interconnections. She speaks, I was attracted to it because of the proximity to African bronzes and to the pre-Columbian art of West Mexico. I was interested in the calligraphy because of these connections. So she takes this interest, and as we can see here, she becomes one of a handful of scholars who receives a fellowship to a Fulbright grant to go to China to study. She studies at a museum there. And when she comes back, she has a postdoc at USC to study the Chinese language and begins teaching first at Cal State Long Beach and then at Cal State Dominguez Hills. While she's at Dominguez Hill, she receives this invitation to teach at LACMA. And she takes this position hoping that she's going to be able to make this contribution to help LACMA become a more fully inclusive institution. You know, she sees arts education as this department that will help her achieve those goals and help LACMA achieve its goals. But she's quickly kind of dismayed by the slowness of that institutional change. And she leaves LACMA and begins teaching at Scripps. This is where, and she would continue to teach from 1970 to 1984.
Can I say something about that?
Yes.
This is something totally different, but Dr. Carl Engelhardt,
Uh-huh.
his son, there's a restaurant right across the street called Gracias Madre. His son was the founder of it.
Amazing, amazing. I just want to take a moment to also contextualize a few other works here in this exhibition. So, you know, as we're getting into the late 60s and early 70s, she's making different works that we can see here. So this work in the back over the fireplace, Field, she says, "Field is the closest I've come to any kind of protest." And you have to read into what I'm saying. It isn't somebody with a machine gun or a machete. This is another kind of protest, but it's about the same thing. But it's also about centrifugal forces, and you rise up. And I did a lot of large lino cuts during the 60s. I tried to get that kind of movement that was involved enough, yet loose enough to have within those symbols themselves an expression of ideas that one could not immediately recognize. So we have two examples of those lino cuts in the back of this room as she's moving more towards abstraction. And one of the things that I took note of is that she reflects on her relationship with Catlett and remembers that Catlett was actually really interested in abstraction, but felt that her need to communicate through her art outweighed the need for abstraction. So she stayed figurative, she stayed in ways that helped communicate her vision for an emancipatory practice. And so in some ways, I do see, you know, you could imagine that Lewis's move into abstraction is this kind of freedom that Catlett didn't feel that she had to experiment with. So during this time, Lewis is incredibly productive. She's part of a community of Black artists in Los Angeles, building a community and network of Black arts movement that takes shape following the Watts Rebellion in 1965. They're gathering in places like Brockman Gallery and Leimert Park, or the Watts Towers Arts Center. And this kind of community we might remember in exhibitions like Now Dig This or Soul of a Nation. And this is a community of artists working at the intersection of Black aesthetics, of Black community, and Black power movements. So we can see here some of her activity as an artist. She is in a show at Women's Space that is housed within the Women's Building here in Los Angeles, with who would become Senga Nengudi, along with Suzanne Jackson and Betty Saar. She's part of this Black Artists Association, or we can also see this community that of artists who are actively changing. There's an aesthetic unfolding during this time that she is a part of. And of course, the work, this poster for the Black Artists Association is by Samella Lewis. Francine, I wonder if you could share anything around your time at Scripps as a student while you were there.
It's a big question. And there was so much.
I can ask a more directed question.
Well, some of the highlights were Elizabeth Catlett came to one of her classes that I took, and Howard Smith also came to one of her classes. Mary Jane Hewitt, very important people in African art history. Elizabeth Catlett was especially just wonderful, just her presence and her grace. For my thesis, she had me writing letters to Barbara Chase Ruble and Floyd Coleman and maybe 20 artists. Compared to African American artists who responded to me, but also artists who were in Mizwati and co-authored volumes. And I was comparing the African American artists to African artists. She took me, literally invited me, and I think paid for the trip to go to Chicago for NCA, National Conference of Artists conference, which was really phenomenal. Being a student, I didn't know there were so many Black artists, and that even this organization existed. So I enjoyed that. Met David Hammonds, Murray DePillars, Virginia, E.J. Montgomery, before I got to know her better on the East Coast. That was really phenomenal, that conference. She was just hugely influential, as I was saying, in so many ways, like unspoken, just the fact that she existed, that she was so talented, she was very, very soft-spoken, and just a very good listener. And I was quiet myself, so we communed almost like telepathically. So there's just so many things.
Thank you so much for sharing. This time is incredibly productive and generative for Dr. Lewis. She is producing exhibitions and exhibition catalogs. This Bernie, Betty, Noah, and John was at Scripps. She makes the book Black Artists on Art with Ruth Waddy, who takes as its conceit that Black artists are generating a new aesthetic and a new theory around art. And she documents it in her book, and it's poetic, it's and sometimes it's informal. It is kind of generating a new kind of scholarship that is unfolding as she is making work and as she's in community with artists making work. She later goes on to make a survey text, a watershed text called Art African American. You may recognize this work of hers on the cover. I think there's an interesting formal technique that she uses of this kind of outlining of the face that we see here, that we can see in this this work behind us. And we see a little bit here as well of the shading from between this kind of like from the forehead to the top of the crown. She also served as a delegate for as a North American delegate for FESTAC in 75 and 77. Now, I know you have stories about this.
I didn't see her the whole time I was there.
It was a good time. Lewis's diasporic curatorial approach is kind of redefined in many ways through her relationship to this global community. FESTAC is this global phenomenon that is seen as this convergence of Pan-African ideals. It's a landmark cultural festival that takes place in Lagos that's seen as being unmatched before and since. It's a festival that included concerts, colloquia, films, art shows, and there was even a regatta. The photographer Marilyn Nance described Festec as, it was the Olympics plus a biennial plus Woodstock. She told an interviewer in her book, people positioned it as science fiction, but it really did happen. And so Lewis is, her framework for the world is through this interconnected tetheredness of the African diaspora. She starts the Black Arts International Quarterly in 1976, which is published intentionally as this very slick journal that is meant to put established artists in conversation with folk artists, with artists who are working around the world. She makes that with Val Spalding and Jan Jemison as they're sitting in the living room of Lewis's Claremont home. It becomes their way of addressing the lack of visibility of African-American artists and museums, in museums and media in general. And they decide to publish a magazine to do something about it. Lewis takes on the role of writing the articles, Val takes on the role of editing them, and Jan takes on the role of their business manager. By 1976, they published their first issue, and this is a publication that would later become the International Review of African American Art. As part of their advertising strategy, they announced that each issue would contain full-color reproductions of works by new and established artists. Graphics, sculptures, crafts, and photographs would make each issue of Black art a showcase, and it would provide a kind of cultural vision and provide an in-depth look and understanding of contemporary artists. And she thinks about this, like in her reflection, this 20-year reflection of this journal, as a way of providing a scope that she's allowed to travel the world. She is also seeing how artists are able to establish them more as a result of being in these journals. And she says through the magazine, she began to understand the richness of African cultures from a global perspective. And so including a global perspective of Black culture was a way to enrich the lives of Black people so that they could have a better understanding of their interconnectivity together. And she said, each issue was like painting for me, just like a work of art. If I put something in there that didn't feel right, I would take it out. And at that time, I really transferred my painting and drawing to the magazine, and that became my creative instrument. It was like each issue was a painting. There was a balance. There was a rhythm, a certain kind of variety of things, but yet the interrelationship existed. And we never took articles just to fill out the magazine. We really tried to make them work with one another. And so we see the movement of her creative energy into journals. We see it into making slides. We see it into making survey texts. And so through the auspices of this journal, she begins also traveling the world. We see some photos of her travels here. On the left, we have images from Rio, and on the right, images from Bahia. And on traveling to Rio and Bahia, she says, I would go and sit up all night and listen to and tape samba, and people explaining to me the relationship of samba to their lives. It wasn't just a dance for them, but it was an expression of life. And most of them were visual artists. So I was interested in artists who not only could see the visual artists, but also had a sensory perception for the auditory art, the music, and the dance. They were complete art forms for me. I went to one of the carnivals in Bahia where I saw floats made of trash. This was not only a protest, but it was an expression of a real concern about many things, and I was able to document this happening. So like those in the Black arts movement, Lewis was interested in understanding African American art and culture within a broader diasporic landscape. Rather than orient Black art in relation to Europe, Lewis began formalizing a Black aesthetic discourse within the African diaspora. This is material announcing the development of the Museum of African American Art that Lewis founds with Mary Jane Hewitt. And they start in Santa Monica, and they find their home in the May Company building and the Baldwin Hills Crenshaw Plaza. And for Lewis, this was really exciting because she, in her travels to Japan, saw that there were museums and art spaces and malls. And so she thought this was this was a kind of transfer of that experience to Los Angeles. And she also, at this time, starts building a collection for the museum. She also starts curating a really fantastic, a dynamic curatorial program. And she's putting artists in conversation and making these kinds of statements around diasporic connectivity. So at the Women's Building in 1986, she brings Catlet into conversation with Nike Olaniyi, who is a noted textile artist who also develops an art space to help cultivate and ensure the legacy of textile art in Nigeria. She develops this exhibition with Jacob Lawrence to showcase his work outside of the social realism kind of framework that he had been really noted for in the United States. So she takes the personal work from Lawrence's collection and Gwendolyn Knight's collection, and it goes first to scripts. And through E.J. Montgomery's work with the United States Information Agency, she travels this show internationally. So the show goes to Kingston, Jamaica, Bridgetown and Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Dominican Republic, Caracas. It goes on to the continent in Harare, in Durban, in Kampala, in Dakar. And so it was for Lewis this way of creating this dialogue between Black American art making and those of the African diaspora, and finding this shared connectivity and sharing his practice and his worldview with students primarily. He would show this show traveled through many of the state museums there, and so it had this high visibility. And then later, by the late 90s, she develops this exhibition called Celebration, Sights and Sounds of Being at USC. And this becomes a way of thinking about, I think, going back to the role of festivals that she'd been studying in her travels, the role of spirituality that has always stayed with her from her earliest experiences in the Biotesh region, and is making an exhibition around both largely Los Angeles-based artists, but also in a national and international framework, and putting them into conversation around how artists are thinking about, how Black artists in particular are thinking about the role of art in community, the role of art as a record-keeping framework, as a kind of way of telling stories and moving them forward to the future. All right. So we see in this show some of her later work. We have Man Playing Clarinet from 2005, which is here. We have a bird in a bush, which is back there. And it's so interesting to see her work persist, right? That she was an artist first, she was an artist always. And she said later, I want people to begin to recall and think about things that might have been important to them, other than the money that they make, other than the cars that they have or the promotion that they might get. It's just a little something that I think I can do that's needed. I think we have to recall and the things that we easily forget, the things that made a difference in our lives and added some kind of spark to our lives. It's not always the big things, it's the little things. So Samella Lewis's investment in defining aesthetics of Black art sought to draw on diasporic lineages and that sought to serve as a conduit between the past and the present. She wrote, "Art is important as a carrier of the ideas of past civilizations and as an antenna which keeps us in touch with the undercurrents of our own time." Through her vision of a Black diaspora, Lewis deepened art historical connections between embodied knowledge and aesthetics that sought to build a world for African American art with expansive histories and futures. She touched on every part of the system of the art world. As an artist, as a museum founder, a curator, an educator, she built opportunities for Black art to be experienced and to be understood beyond geographic borders and beyond time. And that is what I got. So I'm happy to answer any questions or yes.
That was fabulous, thank you. But
Thank you.
I'm curious about your personal acquaintance with Samella, when you became aware of her work and what you thought of it at that time and how it changed over time as you learned to learn more.
Sure. So my personal awareness of Samella Lewis came from my mother. And, my mother was traveling to New Orleans and she would say to me, "Oh, you've got to go to Stella Jones. You've got to learn about Samella Lewis. You've got to, and I was a baby student. This was, in college, and so that's how she first came into my understanding. It was actually through my mother's understanding of an art world or an art history that was, grounded in here in Los Angeles. And then as she moved to the South in New Orleans, and what I have learned, working in her archive, speaking with those that are her loved ones, has been a kind of vision for and a kind of stick-to-itedness of not being deterred, of seeing what needs to be done and doing it. And so, in order to teach art history, you have to have slides. So she started making slides that could be bought and, you could and sold. And so people could teach in her class. They could teach artists in their classrooms. She started, she made a book so that people have this kind of record. She made multiple books, I have really been struck by the way in which, as Francine mentioned, that she was a very quiet person, but she was a very determined person. And so seeing what it takes to do everything that she has done, for our research project, it takes about 8 scholars to be able to unpack each an element of her practice. And that's not even the whole thing. And it's not the personal story either. It is this kind of the imprint or the traces that we see in the archive that allow us to tell some parts of the story. So, it's been a balance between learning from her, speaking in her own words, learning from those who loved her and who she loved, and from the archive of stitching together just how you do something like this, how you can have a vision to create something that doesn't exist.
They were fearless too about what they were doing, but my parents, they were really my first inspiration for Black business. And I said they were fearless because when we moved to upstate New York, Blacksburg, New York, we were the only Black family in the whole city, literally. And they opened up a branch of the NAACP. So that tells you something about them. And they had membership.
Yeah, amazing.
Those different festivals that they did, like the one in Nigeria, or different things that she put together as well, as far as like Black and African American art. Do you think things like that can happen again on that magnitude?
Oh, Festec magnitude. Please.
That's that with a bunch of major artists and Black thinkers. And it was wonderful, but I would not take that flight in today's climate.
I think that anything is possible. I think we live actually in a much more connected world than they did. And so it might look different. But I think that the stars have to align in a certain kind of way for another Festac. I don't know. An Olympics, a biennial, and a Woodstock all in one. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I've been to that could.
I feel like there's something similar like that. Doesn't have to be that exact.
Yeah.
Just something like in that realm of the culture coming together, different people from around the world coming together. It doesn't have to be even that huge, but just something like that. Like you have the LAR show that goes on, or Freeze that goes on. So it's like, I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, I mean, you might even think of something like King Day, like the King Day Festival. That I think that's originated, has that kind of tether to this movement. I think that it is a matter of fearlessness, of bringing people together and finding the space. I think it happens probably in smaller instances locally in a lot of different cities, but you should do it.
I have a question. You mentioned that she opened a museum, and that I think it was the May Company. Is that the Macy's? With that turned
Yes.
into the Macy's?
Yes.
Yeah, I've been there a few times. One, I've seen some great exhibits there.
Yes.
I haven't been there in a while. I don't know if it's still
Good.
there.
Yeah, it's on the other side.
Oh.
I went a couple weeks ago.
Oh.
It's very great.
Amazing.
And then I have there was an exhibit recently at the Vincent Price Museum. It was called Act on It, and it was about artists who had shows at the Blockman Gallery, which you mentioned a couple of times. And she had several pieces in that show. Is there a tie-in with her museum and the old Blockman Gallery? Was she inspired by that? In opening her own museum?
I think that's a great question. I think that there is probably a network of spaces that she was inspired by. Brockman certainly being one of them, the Watts Towers Arts Center being another, the Compton Communicative Arts Academy being another. And it's this matrix of like a gallery, a for-profit gallery, and art spaces, art education spaces, of using and relying on Cal State LA and different kinds of universities. So I think there is a moment that she is a part of where Black artists are building institutions, and at different scales with different kinds of goals in mind. And Brockman kind of quickly turns into a nonprofit space as well. I mean, she's part of this community, and so I think, and the once she gets to the Crenshaw Plaza, she's just around the corner. So I think this is very much a part of how she's understanding what's possible, what the need is, what the temperature is for the kind of desire for a space that can showcase art Black art within a museum context, because that is, museums serve this role of being the stewards and the arbiters of history of putting forward legacy, of maintaining legacy. And so I think that what she did in forming this museum is understanding that really unique role that museums can hold. And then she becomes a consultant for the California African American Museum. And so she sees like there is a unique place that museums can hold within the art world.
Miami exhibit. Claude was telling me about there's going to be one more exhibit of Rotten.
Yeah, at Blackmont
Mm.
later this year. Yeah.
Brockman was certainly, I think it will be the gift that keeps on giving. There's so much more to learn there. I know that the archives are at the LA Public Library. This museum will pull together artworks. And so, there's ways to understand how they ran the gallery, there's ways to understand the community of artists that were there. Ruth Waddy is there along with Samella Lewis. Others, John Outerbridge is someone who becomes very important to Samella Lewis. I don't know, I think you have some memories of John Outerbridge as well that... And he was an early founder of the Watts Towers Arts Center. And so, there's this kind of, I think Brockman is an anchor for a lot of this activity that we see happening within the Black arts movement in Los Angeles.
You'd go to an opening, I remember as a child, and it'd be like all the Black celebrities would be there. It was awesome. Yeah, and Alonzo and Gail, they were just so nice.
Yeah, well, there were two exhibits last year on, one was at the Vincent Price Museum and the other one was in East LA also. So,
Yeah, those were the predecessors to what they're gonna do at Latin.
Oh, wow.
Latin was involved with both.
Right.
So, and each one is a little better, they have a little more work. So I can't wait to see what Latin does. So it'd be nice.
Her collecting, she's
Yes.
a major collector.
Yes.
She gave, donated African art to the National Museum of African Art.
Mm.
I'd be curious to know what exactly. I saw a few things that were put up on display. I remember visiting her several times, and she'd have something different each time in her, in her living room on display. Really fantastic thing. Once there was a Northern Cameroon, like mending grasslands, feather dress. It was just stunning works of art that she just put around the private museum space there. And her collecting was, I think, important for her own artistry, her own conception, understanding, her anthropological grounding. It was interesting to learn, listening to her interview, that she did study with Herskovitz at some point, and then also Sherman Lee, the Chinese expert who became director of the Cleveland Art Museum. She was at Swell to the Freer. Maybe that's where she first met Sherman Lee before he went to Cleveland. But she was seeking out mentors at the highest level, Chinese and American.
Yeah.
And a lot of her collecting, when she would travel and with the magazine and do, articles on different artists, she would always try to buy stuff just to support,
And I think there's a really amazing aspect of community building that she does through her endeavors as well, right? So there's the community that she's a part of, that's part of her life, and then there is with that community, she creates these opportunities in these platforms for them to gain visibility, exhibition making being one of them, publications being another. And so she becomes this very important like underpinning to a kind of formalization of African American art, particularly as it's grounded here in Los Angeles. And so that's a really, really significant part of her practice, is to say, like, let's actually redefine how we've been valuing art by understanding this other kinds of values we can put forward that are centered around Blackness. And that might look like spiritual practice. It might look like understanding this relationship between art and life. It might look like moving between the visual and the performance, and so she really imagined this way of creating an active art history, an art history that was unfolding in real time, that was really centered, particularly from her time here in Los Angeles, and really challenged what it meant for art history to have to be Eurocentric. You know, as you just mentioned, you know, her experience and her expertise in Chinese art, Native American art. She mentioned her interest in calligraphy was in part due to this relationship to African bronzes. So she is making these connections and putting them forward as a way of understanding cultural heritage. Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure to be in conversation with you all.